Hi, everyone. Welcome to Research and Data Analysis Communication 643 with me, Dr. Kylie Wilson. Oops. So this first set of notes are going to be a little lecture heavy. I apologize. We have 3 chapters to get through and a page within a 4th chapter. It's just based on the assignment, so we're kind of reading heavy for this first part. So we'll go ahead and get down to it. So first, we talk about research. Keaton does a great job at explaining research and what it is and different types of research. So knowing that research is the discovery of answers to our questions, we apply the systematic procedures and the scientific method. First, we talk about social science. Social science is all about conducting research through the use of scientific and systematic methods, and it's based on this assumption that we can uncover patterns in the lives of people. So social science, we think of studying people, social situations. Empirical research is based on observations or experiences of communication. So things we observe in everyday life. We also have proprietary research, which is all about being commissioned by a specific organization or an individual for their use. Moving forward, we talk about some of the goals of research. First, describing behavior. We can describe outcomes, processes, even ways in which our variables or the concepts we study, the relationship between all of them. We talk about determining the causes of behavior. So we can describe the behavior, but now we can explore why are people doing this specific way? And we can use that for interventions, developing trainings, as well as increase effectiveness of our understanding. So it's not enough to just describe the behavior. We can then, in turn, determine what causes that behavior. And from there, we can even predict future behaviors. So we can anticipate what will happen based on what other people have observed and can help us make better decisions in the future as well. And then finally, explaining the behavior. So we understand, what caused it, we can describe it, we can predict future behaviors, but we can explain the understanding of why that behavior occurs. Moving forward, we talk about communication as a social science. So we talk about quantitative and qualitative methods. And both of these methods we're going to hear a lot about during this semester. So quantitative methods, is research that's going to rely on that numerical measurement. So it is something that we quantify, okay? Qualitative methods is going to be research in which the researchers observe participants firsthand. So we're not quantifying those numbers. They're not filling out surveys. It could be something along the lines of, I want to understand what once a bear cat, always a bear cat means. And therefore, I go to several different things around campus and just observe people to really see if I can understand that, okay? So I've talked about the scientific approach. Now we're going to get into what that is. First, we have to start with a question or at least a problem of interest. This is something that should be of great interest to you. Nothing worse than studying some phenomena that you don't even care about. So we use this question or problem to formulate our educated guesses. This leads us into a hypothesis and or research questions, and they're a little bit different. So hypotheses are tentative educated guesses, propositions about relationships between two or more variables. These are things that we are predicting based on the literature or theory, things that we've seen. We can make these predictions. Research questions are going to ask about that tentative relationship. It might ask about the state or the nature of the phenomenon. So the research question is that. It is a question. It's not a prediction. So I predict that all Northwest students, by the time they leave after graduation, will be enriched with this or ingrained with this once a bear cat, always a bear cat, right? That's a hypothesis. A research question might be, will certain majors have the once a bear cat, always a bear cat ingrained in them more than other majors? You see how they're different? One's the prediction and one is simply a question that I want to further explore. Okay? Moving forward, we talk about using reasoning and experience to think through our hypotheses or our cues, research questions that are developed, right? So we have to use reasoning. We have to logically make sense of what we have developed, okay? Fourth, we design and construct observations, measurements, and or experiments, right? So if we're using qualitative data, we're probably going to do more observations. If we're using quantitative, we might use more measurements or experiments. We can do experiments with both of them, however. And fifth, finally, data are analyzed and interpreted in reference to the hypotheses excuse me, and research questions. So after we collect all of our data, we then have to interpret it. And interpreting it isn't necessarily easy or necessarily hard. It depends on your level of understanding of research methods. Moving forward, we talk about some characteristics of science. This is listed in the book, so I'm just going to go through them quickly. But first, the research must be based on evidence, and it has to be testable. Since we are using the scientific method, we have to have evidence of some sort. Could be qualitative, could be quantitative, but we have to be able to test it, and other people have to be able to test it to replicate studies again. We have to explore all possible explanations in an effort to demonstrate that the proposition cannot be discovered. We have to do our due diligence to make sure that we are providing explanations that are actually factual, okay? The results of research studies should be replicable or repeatable. We need to have people doing our studies again after we've done them. This helps them stand up to the test of time as well. Fifth, for replication to occur, the research has to be part of the public record, meaning it needs to be published somewhere. It needs to be something that somebody could find and find all the variables we have used and retest them. Moving forward, sixth, because it's part of the public record, it's also self-correcting, meaning people can see things changing over time, minimal shifts. They're still standing the test of time, but they're correcting mistakes that we might have made along the way. Seventh, scientific research relies on measurement and observation, so we need to be able to measure things. Scientific research is recognized, or has recognized, not is recognized, I apologize, the possibility of error and an attempt to control it. We'll talk about type 1 and type 2 errors later in this semester, but we do know that there is at least some room for error, and we do try to control for that error as much as possible. Objectivity requires that we minimize personal bias and distortion. So, for example, I did my dissertation on the opioid epidemic, and it probably wouldn't be ethical or without my personal bias if I had become addicted to opiates at any point in my life. In my study, I even tried to control for that error where I asked the participants, have you been addicted to opiates? And this is because I'm controlling for the error, but also I'm trying to minimize bias and distortion. Number 10, science by nature rests on an attitude of skepticism, meaning we should be questioning things. Just because something got published doesn't mean it is the end all be all. So We should have an attitude of skepticism. 11th, scientific research has an interest in generalizability. So we want to be able to take our study and with confidence say that we could generalize this to the larger population. And finally, the final characteristic of science is its heuristic nature. And the heuristic means the research findings are going to lead to more questions. This is very common. So in several of my studies, I have test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4, because those questions that I originally planned and the results of those questions led to more questions. Okay. Moving forward, we talk about types of questions that communication scholars would ask. First, the theoretical significance. Questions that follow theoretical significance are going to initiate development of or contribute to further development of theories because they help deepen our understanding. We talk about social importance. Communication is a social activity, so significant questions have a general social importance. And that drives research because it can have an impact on many lives and or society. I apologize for yawning so much. First day of finals week, it has been bananas. Next, we have personal interest. We focus on research that interests or perplexes us as researchers. So maybe we're not enamored by how it could impact society or the theory that's hot at the time, right? There could just be something that perplexes us, something that we want to talk about. Moving forward, we talk about the nature of questions. So we've got questions of definition. This is just about, I apologize. This is just about providing definitions for phenomena in which we are interested. There's questions of relationships. So it's going to examine if, how, and the degree to which phenomena are related. Questions of cause and effect. It asks and answers if one or more variable is the cause of one or more outcome variables. So does this one variable cause this result that we're finding? Questions of value, subjective evaluations of issues, phenomena, and questions of policy. The results of these studies often recommend a course of action, right? So we should implement this intervention of sorts. We should do this to see a decrease in whatever concept we're using, okay? Moving on to chapter 2. So we consider theory in research. Theory is all about a set of interrelated propositions presenting a systematic view of phenomena. So there are all kinds of theories. You have heard about many theories in your degree program this far. You have also So sorry. You have also probably heard about different theories in different areas of research outside of communication. So first we talk about developing a theory. First, the researcher is going to describe an event or observation that we need to understand. Next, they create an explanation for that event. So why do they think this thing is happening? Then the research moves from the specific event or observation to a more generalized form. So we take it away from and make it bigger, so to speak, right? We're making it more generalized. Then we begin to derive predictions from the explanation. So I can use that explanation to begin making my predictions. Next, we have to select a focus and then test that proposed theory. And finally, the researcher then uses the obtained data to confirm, revise, expand, generalize, or even abandon the proposition that we test. Okay. So we talk about a couple different research process models. in chapter 2. The first being deductive research. And this is the researcher moving from a proposition that has already been worked out by others, so from a theory, developing hypotheses, research questions, and then testing by collecting data, right? So we're moving from the theory, then we develop our hypotheses, and then we collect the data. And you can see those steps in 1 through 6 here. Then we talk about inductive research models, and this is where the researcher moves from the specifics of the data to more general. So we identify that problem, we consider existing findings, develop our research question, assign the methods and procedures, gather the data, analyze and interpret that data, and then develop the theory. So the theory fits in last, okay? But we should be evaluating our questions. So first, is our question clearly stated? Is it something that individuals are able to see and understand easily? They're not questioning anything. Do others agree about the clarity of the question? So have other people read your questions and make sure that they're clear. Have you only asked one question per question? So if we are testing a hypothesis or even a research question, oftentimes we have items in our scales which are used for quantitative research. I apologize that a lot of these examples are going to be quantitatively focused because that's the type of researcher that I am, just based on the nature of my doctoral program. But we have items that we rate on Likert. It's actually pronounced Likert, but nobody likes the way that sounds. Likert type scales where I feel satisfied, I feel important, I feel happy, I feel exhausted. And we ask them to rate those on scales of 1 to 7, which we'll talk about later in the semester as well. But I shouldn't combine I feel happy and I feel satisfied. That should be two separate rather than one item on the scale, because that means it's double-barreled. You are asking more than one question. So I could feel happy, but maybe I'm not satisfied. So how do I answer that question? Or do communication majors feel satisfied at the undergraduate level and the graduate level? Those should be two separate questions for two separate groups, if that makes sense. Fourth, what is the communication orientation of the questions? So what's the practice, policy, rule, the procedure, consequences that are being investigated? Is our focus on symbols, messages, or meanings? Fifth, is the question phrased in a way that it is not biased toward a particular answer or solution? This means we don't want to ask a question of, well, here's a hypothetical-ish. I did a study when I was at West Virginia where we were trying to understand social norms influencing engagement in casual sex on college campuses. It would be very biased for me to ask a question or have a statement that says, I do not engage in gross casual sex because it is deemed nasty by the general public. If people who do engage in casual sex see that question, they might think, okay, I need to say, no, I do not engage, or I need to agree with that, whether they do or not, because that question is going to make it seem like engaging in casual sex is a bad thing. And therefore, it's gonna push them towards a solution that maybe we weren't focusing on. Next, is there some way to observe or measure the communication of interest, making sure that we can actually measure what we say we're measuring? Next, can the research, this question, Oh, can we research this question given limitations of time and resources? Are we able actually to do this in a feasible manner that is effective, timely, and resource-wise? Who would be interested in the answer to these questions? And how could those who are interested use this information? So, are there people who are interested in this as well? And how would they use this information? This slide is just developing your initial questions to guide the research process. It's on page 26. Um, if you would like to take their examples and state preliminary, examine the questions, and then restate them, if you'd like to try that just for practice. Moving forward, we talk about analyzing our resources. So first, we're going to talk about online resources. What type of domain does the site come from? Is it a peer-reviewed scholarly academic journal? Is it a web page that anybody could have made? Is it Wikipedia? That's going to change the type of source. Who publishes or owns the site? How can we tell? Is it published or owned by a reputable company? Is it published by somebody who is just vetting their best interests? How current is their website? Is it something that should be updated? If it is updated, when was the last time it was updated? Can you tell us about who created the site? Is there a name? Links? Where do those links take you? Are the author's credentials or affiliations displayed on the website? If it's an academic journal, their title and their affiliations are going to be stated on that first page. If it's an online web page that you just found, they may not have that. What is the purpose of the website? Is advertising clearly labeled? If a source is quoted or paraphrased, is the information about the source provided so you can verify it? Sorry. Now we're talking about analyzing resources in a more general way. How much has been written on this issue? Is it something where there's not a lot out there because it's a new phenomena, or nobody's taken the time to write about it, or has it been overdone like certain topics? How recent or relevant is the material? Typically, we like to stick within 5 years, so you don't want to do research and only cite things from the early 2000s. You can cite seminal pieces. I talk about stigma in my dissertation, and not Goffman. Yes, Goffman. Sorry, hmm, I almost, I can't think of what I was trying to say. I almost tricked myself. But Goffman, the original study was done in 1963. This doesn't mean that Goffman's work in 1963 is not good or reputable anymore. It just means that it is the original piece and people have done things to update it. Okay. Has some critical event occurred or societal value that changed or could challenge the interpretation of the answers? If you wanted to study, I don't know, how students learn online, pre-COVID is going to be different than post-COVID because we've had a lot of updates since COVID happened because we had to. Who has done the work on this issue? Where has the research on this topic been published? What aspects of the issue receive the most attention? What questions have been answered? What aspects have been ignored? These are all things that we need to take into consideration. If people are already doing this, we could either replicate their study or we could add to it based on what's been ignored or unanswered. Are there reasons to replicate studies that have been conclusive? What other issues have we found related to our primary issue, right? Something may come out of this just based on the issue of what's been done, okay? Next, we talk about literature reviews. So with the literature review, we have this framework of the research, investigation, interpretation, integration, and critical analysis of published literature that's relevant to our study. So what that means is we're taking all of these relevant studies and we are putting them in our front half of our paper. So what that means is we are going to introduce this problem. We're going to say several people have had this issue and they have researched it, and here's what they're saying. And we use that as evidence to share why we're doing this study. So the introduction to the literature review starts with introducing us to the problem, our problem statement that describes our communication problem we are investigating, and our research objectives broadly. Then we talk about the body of the literature review. So we account all of our variables and concepts that we use in the study. We include the latest research, publications, including analysis, synthesis, critiques of the work, provided assessment of previous efforts, and suggesting why these issues should be explored again or explored in different ways. Moving forward, we talk about how we organize the literature review, and we organize our information in a way that makes sense to describe what the topic is, what's been done, and what we're doing. So below, you'll see a table that states the organizing framework and the description and uses. I'm not going to go through these as this table is right there and it's in your book. But you should use this when you're trying to figure out how you want to organize your literature review. Next, how do we conclude the literature review? You conclude it by presenting your hypotheses or research questions. You give a summary of your analysis of the existing literature and what your study is going to do or what your study did, and you provide future directions researchers should take and discuss your study's limitations. So one of the limitations I had for my dissertation, and this is huge for writing up your papers, one of the limitations I had was how I referred to people who had been addicted to opiates within the story that I made my participants read. So I had 3 conditions. The first condition referred to people as people who are addicted to opiates. The second condition referred to them as people who have opioid use disorder. And the third condition was just used as a baseline to gauge what people thought about opioid use disorder, opioid addiction. And so they read a story about specific dog breeds getting banned in this fictitious city. So a limitation of my study was that I called them people. Something as simple as calling a group of people people brings that human quality back. So we don't treat them any differently based on what they're called. However, I'm recollecting data where I have 2 conditions. One condition calls individuals opioid addicts, and the other condition calls them people who are addicted to opiates. I want to see if there's that difference now that I've taken people out of one of the conditions. So when we're talking about the literature review, and this is from page 249 of chapter 13, we talk about designing the research including our background and questions. So we've got our title page, which is just the title of the author, the introduction. So we just give a little paragraph where we're introducing the topic, and then we have our literature review. So we review all the publications, we provide background and support for our topic. Then we have our problem statement. Why is this topic something that we should care about? Why should people be doing research, or why should you read this research? And then we end up with our research questions and hypotheses. I drew a little map on this over chapter 13, page 249. So it shows our title page, our introduction, and our literature review is next. That's where we have our problem statement, our cues and hypotheses. Then we get into method, which you won't have to worry about for a while, but it's where you describe your participants, research procedures, and your variables. You get into your results, then your discussion is where you share your limitations and your future directions, and then you have your references. This is going to be your reference list, so every source you use and cited, as well as your tables and your figures. Again, we'll get to that later. Finally, ending on chapter 2, we talk about evaluating our questions. We're continuing on. I think this is a little out of order. Oh, no, we've already answered that. This is the slide that should have been taken out. So we'll just move on to chapter 3. Chapter 3, we're going to talk about some ethical responsibilities. We have some responsibilities as researchers to be ethical in everything that we are producing and publishing. So we talk about the scientific responsibility. Researchers are responsible for their profession, their discipline, and expected to follow the guidelines that are developed and prescribed by their sponsor, so potentially their department, university, association, funding agency, right? Here at Northwest, if we are collecting data, we have to have city training, and it's good for 3 years. We have to get approval from the institutional review board here at Northwest before we even collect data. Those are 2 things that we have to absolutely do. However, some do not require those or both of those, or they require other things in addition to that. The relationships with participants' responsibility. So we have to assess the extent to which the nature of the research participant relationship is going to affect the collection, interpretation, and reporting of data. So if you know somebody extremely well, they might not be the best to include in your study because your relationship could impact their answers. So first, is the research designed, reviewed, and conducted in a way to ensure integrity, quality, and transparency? And these are questions that we should be asking when we are designing studies. Second, what are the benefits of the study? How can the study contribute to this larger understanding within the field of communication? And are they primarily going to be for participants, or are they going to be for other people outside of the participants, people in general? How will consent of the participants be given to participate in the study? Are we going to have them consent orally? Are they going to consent in writing? Who is going to give consent? If the participant is capable of giving consent, should they be doing it? If not, who is capable of it? How much information about the study needs to be given prior to, in advance, and what information should be debriefed or given afterwards? Next, how can the confidentiality and anonymity of research participants be handled? Can we disguise their identity? Who will have access to the data? With something like this, usually they're stored on a secure server, or if they're paper surveys or paper transcriptions, stored in a locked cabinet in a locked office, things like that. Are the participants appropriate to the purpose of the study? Are they representative of the population that we want to benefit from this research, right? If I want to study people who are addicted to opioids, using a convenience sample, which we'll talk about later, of college students probably isn't the best use of my time because they're not necessarily generalizable for my study. What potential harm, both physical or psychological, could come from the participants as a result of the study, right? So physical harms you don't really see in communication aspects. I mean, if you're studying physiological responses and you put the sticky pads for the EKG or EEGs, stuff like that, on you, it might have a little bit of skin irritation, but typically we're going to talk about the psychological harms. Most communication studies that I have seen have a low psychological harm. The risks are minimal. However, there could be some risk, right? Especially if you are decepting them, which we'll talk about deception later in this lecture, I believe. Have the researchers identified and selected their participants in such a way that they are participating voluntarily, free from coercion? If we are using students as our population, right, and we're saying you can get extra credit for this, we're not necessarily coercing them, or we're not coercing them, not necessarily. What this means is I can still give extra credit for my studies to be collected in classes and stuff. However, that consent form that says this is what we're going to do. Do you agree or do you not agree to participate? And if they don't agree, then they will not be harmed. They won't receive extra credit, but they will not be harmed. It won't hurt their reputation or anything by not agreeing. Next, what are the consequences of the study for participants? Will the harm be outweighed by benefits? Will reporting or publishing the outcomes of the study create risk or harm for participants? How is the researcher's role going to affect the study? Is the research design valid or credible? Does it take into account relevant theory, methods, prior findings? Is the researcher capable of carrying out the procedures in a valid and credible manner? So do they have the know-how to understand what they're actually studying? And has the researcher disclosed their affiliation so participants, and consumers can assess if any potential conflicts of interest arise, right? So by disclosing your affiliations, you can say, hey, there's not any conflict of interest. Next, we talk about some more responsibilities. We talk about beneficence. I don't know that that's spelled correctly or if I said it correctly. It's the first one on this slide. I apologize. This is the well-being of participants being protected, right? We want to make sure that everybody who is participating in the study is protected. Their identity, any data they provide, it is not being sold or used outside of the study, and even the researchers do not have access to say who answered what. Next, respect for the people, involving two separate principles. First, we have to treat individuals as capable of making decisions. We have to trust that you can make decisions as a participant. And two, protecting those who are not capable of making their own decisions. So, if somebody is not capable of making their own decisions, for example, minors, right? They are not legal adults, and therefore they might have some decision-making capabilities, but legally they can't. So for something like that, we would have to get their consent, but also their parents' consent. And it goes to a full IRB, full board review. It's a process. It is a long process. Justice. We have an issue of fairness. Excuse me, sorry. We want to make sure that all of our participants are treated equally. Then we have IRB. So this is review committees that review research proposals for approval before any data is collected. We determine, or the IRB determines, if the rights and welfare of participants have been adequately protected based on your study. We talked about informed consent a little bit already, but it's just participants agreeing to participate in the research project after they have been given the basic information about the research study. So it tells them everything. Maybe not in great detail. Some things could be vague, especially if you have to deceive them. However, we are telling them how many participants we want, what we're doing in the study, how their data will be stored. So identification of the research and sponsoring organization, description of the purpose of the investigation, main features of the research process. That goes in that informed consent. Then we talk about intentional deception. So researchers purposely mislead participants, and it is used when it is necessary for participants to be uninformed of the purpose so they respond accurately. So the people who were in my baseline for my dissertation, they read the story on banned dog breeds, and they were intentionally deceived because I wasn't asking about dog breeds. I was asking about opiates. But I had to have them read that so I could gauge the baseline understanding of the opioid epidemic. All right. And on to our last slide. Finally, we have Confederates. This is somebody who pretends to be participating in the research project, but they're actually helping the researcher. It is a type of deceptive practice. When I was at West Virginia, I was a part of a study that was on video game research where we used a Confederate. And we watched them come into the lab and play some video game where the Confederate was told that they were going to be the boss in this game. And they weren't actually playing, but they were hitting buttons like they were playing. They were part of our research team. But we wanted to study how people engage with games who weren't Confederates, who weren't part of the research team, right? So using Confederates is a type of deceptive practice, but sometimes it's necessary. We talk about anonymity, names, identifying information are never attached to data. The source of the message is absent, unknown, or unspecified. We want to make sure that they are completely anonymous. Confidentiality. So any information or data that the participants provide is controlled, so it is not revealed to others in the study or outside of our research team, right? So if I have a co-author, me and my co-author have access to all of the data. We do not have access to participant names, and none of the participants in the survey or whatever type of data we're collecting nobody in that data set would know about your participation. And then finally, debriefing. So this is the opportunity for the researcher to interact with participants immediately following the research activity. And typically we explain the purpose of the study or what we hope to find. And this is where you would say, okay, you were intentionally deceived. And now here's where you can go to, I don't know, get help should you need, or who you can reach out to. For example, I did a study on trigger warnings on TikTok. I'm in the process of getting that published currently. However, that study had to have debriefing because I was intentionally lying to people. I was intentionally, well, not lying or deceiving really, but I had two conditions, one that came with a trigger warning and one that didn't. It was disturbing content, and I couldn't tell people that it's going to be disturbing content because that's exactly what I was studying. So I debriefed them on here's why I did it, here's what I did, your research is going to help me find this, and here's several resources if you are feeling shaken up that you can use. And it was collected here on campus. So here at Northwest, right? That's going to be included in your debriefing. Again, I apologize this was so long. Most of the chapters should not be this long. It's just this first one. We've got an annotated bibliography coming up, and you also have your literature reviews coming up. So I wanted to add as much of that in there as possible for this first week. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. And I look forward to working with you the rest of this semester.